Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This column, written by C.P. Rajendran, evaluates the environmental impact of constructing mega hydropower dams in the Himalayan region by India and China. See, the Himalayan mountain range is known for its tremendous hydropower potential. This potential arises because of the young-fold nature of the Himalayan mountains that provides for deep gorges with a steep slope gradient, which is responsible for increasing the velocity of the flow of the water. See, the Himalayan mountains are located across one of the world's most active tectonic zones, where the Indian plate is diving under the Eurasian plate. This ongoing tectonic activity is what pushes the Himalayan mountains upwards, and hence the Himalayan region tends to grow every year. So compared to the stable Deccan Plateau and the Western Ghats of India, the Himalayan mountains are young-fold mountains as they are much younger in age, and this makes them unstable as well. The young-fold nature and the constant growth of the mountains and constant tectonic activity has provided for deep gorges with a steep slope gradient, which increases the velocity of the flow of the water. Then upon this, the Himalayan region is blessed with glaciers and snowfall that ensures a perennial supply of water to all the rivers and the tributaries that take origin in the Himalayan range. Be it the Indus River and its tributaries, or the Ganga and its tributaries, or the Brahmaputra and its tributaries, they all have tremendous hydropower potential because of these factors. So countries that are a part of this drainage basin, including India, Nepal, Bhutan, China and Bangladesh, and even Pakistan with regard to the Indus River, they have all focused on exploiting the hydropower potential of the Himalayan rivers. And numerous hydropower dams have been built in this region, and several mega dam structures have also been planned for the future. With regard to the Indus River basin, India, Pakistan and even China are actively building a number of hydropower projects. Then with regard to the Ganga and the Brahmaputra basin, the concerned countries, that is India, China, Nepal, Bhutan and Bangladesh, have also lined up a series of hydropower projects in the region. Particularly in the Brahmaputra basin, there is a mad rush between India and China to construct mega hydropower dams, and this rush is driven by two factors. One, because of the ongoing strategic competition between the two countries. As a part of their border tensions and ongoing military standoff, both the countries are looking at stepping up their border infrastructure, and this not just includes the construction of roads and railway lines, but it also includes the construction of hydropower dams, which can bring better connectivity and economic development to the northeast of India and the Tibet region of China. Then apart from this, India and China and even several other countries from around the world, they are relying upon hydropower in order to achieve carbon neutrality as a part of their climate change commitments. Because hydropower is renewable and it is seen to be relatively cleaner as compared to other forms of generating energy such as thermal power. So both India and China are looking to expand their hydropower generation in order to peak their carbon emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So as a part of this climate change objective, both India and China are looking to reduce their reliance on thermal power, and they are investing heavily in renewable and cleaner forms of energy such as hydropower. But this mad rush to construct mega hydropower dams in the sensitive Himalayan region could be fraught with disastrous environmental consequences, according to the writer. The writer argues that the Himalayan region is one of the world's most active tectonic zone, and particularly the northeast Himalayan bend, where the Brahmaputra basin is located, it is extremely vulnerable to seismic activity, and the ecology of the region is highly fragile. See, China is already in the process of building a few mega hydropower dams on the Yarlung Tsangpo River, which is the name for the Brahmaputra in the upper reaches of Tibet. Recently, China has announced one more mega hydropower project closer to the Indian border on the Yarlung Tsangpo River. To counter this Chinese hydropower infrastructure on the Brahmaputra basin, India has also taken up several hydropower projects, especially in Arunachal Pradesh, and it is also looking at the downstream areas of the Brahmaputra in Assam as well. India has been working on the Kameng project on the Bichom and Tenga rivers, and it is also working on the Subansiri Lower Hydroelectricity project. Similarly, India is actively involved in the construction of hydropower dams in Bhutan, and it is also looking to step up hydropower cooperation with Nepal as well. Even China has made massive investments in the hydropower sector of Nepal, and India and China are planning to build many more such projects along the Himalayan region. But according to the writer, this is a hazardous idea for the environment and as well as to humanity. The writer points out how vulnerable hydropower dams can be in a highly seismic zone. The Himalayan region is known to register very high magnitude earthquakes, and particularly the region around the northeast Himalayan bend is highly vulnerable. Data shows that about 15% of the great earthquakes of the 20th century, that is with a magnitude of more than 8, have occurred in the Himalayan region. Geologists believe that several such mega earthquakes can occur in the future as well, and they not only threaten these projects that are being planned or the ones that have already been built, but they also threaten the population in the region and as well as the sensitive ecology and environment of the region. So the writer is calling upon India and China to learn lessons from the 1950 earthquake, which caused massive devastation in Tibet and Assam, because the earthquake not only killed thousands of people and brought down buildings, but it also led to other related disasters such as massive landslides in the region. It even resulted in glacial lake outburst flood events, and they directly contributed to massive changes in the landscape of the region. Secondary disasters such as landslides could result in the formation of natural dams in the downstream areas, and this directly threatens the well-being of a hydropower dam. Because the natural dams that form after a landslide, they could breach at any point and cause massive flooding in the downstream area. Because of the unstable nature of the region and because of the presence of deep gorges with a steep slope gradient, the region can witness landslides even without an earthquake, because ongoing deforestation and massive land use changes is directly contributing to the weakening of the topsoil, and events such as cloudbursts, glacial lake outburst floods, etc., they can trigger even more landslides in the region, thereby threatening the safety of hydropower dams. These disasters, accompanied with the high velocity of water, also contributes to very high deposition of silt in the downstream areas, thereby reducing the carrying capacity of the drainage basin and as well as that of the dam. The writer uses the 2015 Nepal earthquake as a case study in order to explain how earthquakes and the accompanying disasters in the Himalayan region could affect hydropower generation. Following the massive earthquake of 2015, Nepal lost about 20% of its hydropower capacity, and it also caused extensive environmental damage in the region. Then moreover, unsustainable agriculture and industrial activities accompanied with unregulated tourism has contributed to massive deforestation and land use change, and this has accelerated the frequency and magnitude of landslides and other related disasters. So the vulnerability of the Himalayan region to these disasters and the heavy deposition of silt in the downstream areas makes these projects unviable and also extremely damaging to the environment and the local population. Because desilting a dam or a river basin is not an easy exercise, and it is not just technologically challenging, but it is also not economically viable. Then upon this, we still haven't entirely understood as to how man-made dams and reservoirs affect tectonic activity in the Earth's crust. There is some evidence available to indicate that large man-made dams and reservoirs can contribute to tectonic movement and seismic activity, and one such location is the Koyna Dam in Maharashtra. And even though sufficient geological evidence doesn't exist to link dams with tectonic activity, it is quite evident that large dams with their heavy water load can have some sort of impact on seismic and tectonic activity in the Earth's crust. Then along with this, global warming and climate change has accelerated the melting of glaciers, and this could increase the possibility of flash floods, GLOF events, and it could even trigger massive landslides which result in the heavy deposition of silt in the downstream areas. So according to the writer, all these factors make it very clear that the Himalayan region is very vulnerable due to its fragile ecology and due to its active seismicity. So the writer and a few other environmental experts consider these mega hydropower dams in the Himalayan region being planned by India and China to be extremely hazardous for the Himalayan ecosystem, because they threaten not only the biodiversity of the region but also the livelihoods and the well-being of the indigenous community in the region. In fact, a popular Himalayan ecologist, Maharaj K. Pandit, has pointed out that the northeast region of Himalayas has witnessed the highest rate of deforestation and land use changes. And hence, in order to protect the sensitive Himalayan ecosystem from the impact of these large-scale infrastructure projects, he has suggested that the upper Himalayan region should be converted into a nature reserve through an international agreement that involves the countries of this region. He has called upon countries such as India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, and even Bangladesh to set up a Himalayan River Commission that could proactively manage all the issues related to the transboundary rivers of the Himalayan region by focusing on sustainable development in order to mitigate the impact of these disasters. Next, we have another column on page number 7 that deals with air pollution in India. See, the writers of this column, they are associated with UNDP's effort to help India tackle the challenge of air pollution. They argue that India has made significant progress over the years with regard to monitoring of air pollution. The Central Pollution Control Board has come out with the National Air Quality Monitoring Program, and India has come out with a real-time color-coded index known as the Air Quality Index. Under this monitoring program, hundreds of air quality monitoring stations have come up around the country that monitor the air quality in real time. This has enabled us to understand the magnitude and the extent of air pollution, especially in Indian cities. And this, accompanied with well-designed campaigns, has led to greater awareness amongst people with regard to the impact of air pollution. So in this context, the writers argue that while India has made tremendous progress with regard to monitoring of air pollution, it needs to step up its efforts in order to come out with systemic solutions which can lead to the development of innovative policies and strategies that can help us combat air pollution. First, the writers trace the success that India has seen with regard to these policies and strategies that are designed to combat air pollution. First and foremost, they appreciate the Indian government for significantly increasing the budgetary allocation for combating air pollution in 2020-21. Increased budgetary allocation has led to numerous initiatives that is helping the national and the state authorities to effectively tackle air pollution in the country. Next, the writers appreciate the establishment of a dedicated commission for air quality management for the NCR region, that is the National Capital Region around Delhi. This commission has been tasked with the strict enforcement of air quality standards, and it helps the Delhi NCR region to tackle the severe problem of air pollution. Then, with regard to vehicle-based emissions, India is making a lot of progress by switching to Bharat Stage 6 standards from Bharat Stage 4, and the rollout of Bharat Stage 6 by skipping Bharat Stage 5 provides for better quality fuel and more efficient engines, which can directly reduce vehicle-based emissions. Then India has also launched the ambitious National Electric Mobility Mission Plan in order to switch vehicle transport from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Then, to tackle indoor air pollution, we have the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, which has helped in increasing the coverage of LPG connections, especially in the rural areas. But despite these numerous initiatives and increased budgetary allocation, and despite having an efficient monitoring program, India still struggles to deal with the challenge of air pollution. This is because the problem of air pollution is very complex, and it is not an easy task to identify and tackle the different sources of air pollution in the country. So the need of the hour to effectively tackle air pollution is technological innovation accompanied with suitable changes in our economy, in our society, in our laws, in our education, and as well as in our political and institutional domains. Along with this, there has to be proactive participation from the private industry as well, because in a country as diverse as India, and in an economy that is as fragmented as the Indian economy, there are going to be multiple sources of air pollution, and it is not an easy task to identify them and tackle them effectively. So if India envisions the provision of clean air for its people, then there is a need for the government to support all the scientific and research institutions and also rope in the private sector to come out with innovative technological solutions accompanied with suitable changes in the economy, in the society, in our education, in our laws, and as well as in our political and institutional domains. The writers argue that such technological innovation will have to be context specific. Because, for example, the sources of air pollution in Delhi is not the same as that of Chennai. Then the challenges of air pollution in the agriculture sector is not the same as the challenges of air pollution in the manufacturing sector. Then each industry, be it thermal power, be it automobiles, or be it oil refining, they all have their own set of challenges. And hence, if air pollution has to be tackled effectively at the source itself, then we need a context-specific innovation that provides for customized solutions depending on the case. For example, the Indian Agricultural Research Institute has developed a biodecomposer that can specifically help tackle air pollution that emanates from the practice of stubble burning. Then the UNDP is funding a number of startups in the country along with the Indian government, and these startups are being encouraged to develop advanced filters that can remove particulate matter at the source itself. Air filters that can be retrofitted in the industry and on vehicles are being designed by several startups which are funded by the government and by the UNDP. Then indoor plants which have breathable roots, they can be further engineered to promote air purification, especially in an indoor environment, and such context-specific solutions are needed in order to tackle the complex challenge of air pollution. The writers even call upon the Indian government to explore the idea of deploying geospatial technology and satellite-based information accompanied with artificial intelligence to accurately identify the different sources of air pollution and to pinpoint the hotspots of air pollution in the country. For instance, the Geo AI platform developed by the UNDP makes use of geospatial technology along with artificial intelligence to accurately identify non-compliance amongst brick factories, and this technology platform has already enabled the regulators to map out around 37,000 brick factories across the Indo-Gangetic plains. So the writers conclude by saying that India has definitely made tremendous progress with regard to improving its monitoring of air pollution and with regard to launching several dedicated policies and strategies. But however, just monitoring air pollution and just a few standalone initiatives are not sufficient, and hence India requires a context-specific solution to tackle the problem. And this has to be brought out through technological innovations, through a collaboration involving the government, the scientific and research institutions of the country, and more importantly, the private enterprises. Next, we have an article on page number 9 related to India-Bangladesh relationship. See, on the 17th of December, the leaders of India and Bangladesh, that is Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, are all set to take part in a virtual summit. This is a long delayed summit because in March 2020 itself, the summit was supposed to take place with Prime Minister Modi travelling to Bangladesh, but unfortunately the visit had to be cancelled as a result of the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the upcoming virtual summit is of great significance to both the countries, and several important issues are expected to be addressed. First and foremost, both the countries would be focusing on a number of connectivity projects so that it can be a boost for trade between the two countries and as well as for people-to-people relations. India and Bangladesh are planning several road links, rail links, and they are also planning to connect their inland waterways navigation networks in order to boost connectivity between the two countries. As a part of this connectivity initiative, at the upcoming virtual summit, a rail link project is expected to be announced. This rail link would connect Chilahati with Haldibari, and this would be the fifth rail link between Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal. Then in a few months, the sixth railway link is also supposed to be taken up, which seeks to connect Dhaka with India's Siliguri, and this is expected to be inaugurated next year when Prime Minister Modi travels to Bangladesh. Then apart from this, India and Bangladesh are also looking to take up a number of high-impact infrastructure projects under the line of credit that India has announced in 2017. Overall, India has announced a line of credit of $10 billion to Bangladesh, which allows Bangladesh to access concessional funding from India at very reasonable interest rates with a flexible repayment period. Through this Indian funding, a number of high-impact infrastructure projects are expected to be taken up, and the upcoming virtual summit will focus on these discussions. These discussions will also include the Petroleum Friendship Pipeline, which was agreed upon in 2018, but construction of this pipeline has begun recently just last week, and this pipeline project will transport petroleum products between India's Siliguri and Dinajpur of Bangladesh. But one of the biggest demands from Bangladesh would be the signing of the Teesta Water Agreement. See, the Teesta River originates in Sikkim and it flows through West Bengal and drains through Bangladesh. The Teesta River is one of the most important transboundary rivers between India and Bangladesh, and the sharing of these waters has always been a source of dispute in the relationship. The waters of the Teesta are very important for West Bengal and as well as for Bangladesh, and back in 2011 itself, India had already negotiated a water sharing agreement with Bangladesh in the interest of respecting and addressing Bangladeshi concerns, especially after Bangladesh had assisted India in cracking down on several northeast insurgent outfits. The then Indian government was willing to work out a favorable deal that could benefit the people of Bangladesh, but due to domestic and regional politics in West Bengal, the Indian government couldn't go ahead with the deal, and since then, India has not lived up to its promise of signing the Teesta Water Agreement. So this is a long pending expectation of Bangladesh, and India might be expected to fulfill this as soon as possible, and these discussions are likely to take place at the upcoming virtual summit. Then finally, the other concern of Bangladesh is with regard to NRC and Citizenship Amendment Act. The NRC exercise that has been conducted in Assam is directly focused on the issue of illegal migration from Bangladesh. Its objective is to identify genuine Indian citizens and distinguish them from illegal migrants of Bangladesh. But the controversy surrounding the NRC and the policy that India might adopt towards those who have been left out of the NRC list is a cause of direct concern for Bangladesh, and hence Bangladesh would naturally bring up the issue along with its concerns over the Citizenship Amendment Act. Because the Citizenship Amendment Act of India accuses Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan of promoting the persecution of religious minorities in their countries. It seeks to grant citizenship to non-Muslim refugees who might have faced religious persecution in these countries. And naturally, the religion-based exclusion of the Act and the labeling of Bangladesh as a country where minorities are persecuted has not been well received by the Bangladeshi government and by the people of Bangladesh, and there has already been massive protests in the country against India. So these are the several issues that are going to be discussed at the upcoming virtual summit, and we are going to track this topic very closely as more articles will be published in the coming days. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6 that deals with a lawsuit being faced by Facebook in the United States. But we have already covered this topic in detail in our yesterday's analysis, so I would request you to go through this editorial once. Next, we also have a column on page number 6 that highlights the structural issues that are plaguing Indian agriculture. But this again is a topic that we have discussed repeatedly in the backdrop of the new farm laws and the ongoing farmers' protests. We have repeatedly covered the issues concerning the APMC and the minimum support prices, so I would request you to go through the column once. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Jhum cultivation is also known as slash and burn agriculture. It is considered to have a few beneficial and several harmful effects on the environment. In the northeast states, agriculture is primarily based on jhum cultivation. All the three statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because on page number 1, the Hindu carries an image that depicts the people of the northeast of India practicing jhum cultivation. See, jhum cultivation is also known as slash and burn agriculture, and it is a type of traditional and subsistence form of cultivation. Under this cropping technique, farmers, they keep shifting the agricultural field in order to retain the fertility of the soil, and they do this by constantly clearing the trees and other vegetation present around the agricultural fields, and they even set fire to the agricultural fields in order to clear out the crop residue. So this practice results in extensive deforestation and burning of biomass, but however, it is said to have the advantage of improving soil fertility, because burning the agricultural fields is said to introduce potash and a few other nutrients into the soil, and this is expected to increase the soil fertility and the nutrient content. But however, the disadvantages of jhum cultivation is very evident, because when this form of cultivation is the predominant technique in the northeastern states, and when it is practiced on such a large scale, it will result in extensive deforestation of forested areas, and the large-scale burning of biomass also releases a lot of emissions, including carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides, and several other air pollutants. The large-scale deforestation will also reduce oxygen generation in the ecosystem, and the subsequent release of emissions causes not just air pollution, but it also directly contributes to global warming and climate change. Plus, when jhum cultivation is practiced in hilly and slopy areas, it is bound to increase soil erosion and even result in landslides. Because in the absence of trees and vegetation and their root structures which are holding on to the top layer of the soil, the runoff velocity of water increases, thereby weakening the topsoil and making it more vulnerable to soil erosion and landslides. So these harmful environmental consequences will eventually result in the reduction of agricultural productivity as well in the long run. Now let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Gangetic river dolphin is found only in India in the Ganga and Brahmaputra rivers and their tributaries. It has been listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. India launched Project Dolphin in 2006 to conserve the species. Amongst the given statements, the first and the third statements are incorrect. So option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 1 that makes a reference to the Gangetic river dolphins in the Kaziranga National Park. Let's look at the next question. Greyhounds is a police special force unit of which state or states? Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, or both B and C? The correct answer is option D, both B and C. See, the Greyhounds is considered to be an elite police special force belonging to Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and it is primarily used for anti-Naxal operations. The commandos of Greyhounds are well trained in jungle warfare and guerrilla warfare, and they are considered to be very effective against Maoists and Naxals in the region. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 4 that makes a reference to the Greyhounds of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana with regard to a counter-insurgency operation that has been carried out in the Swabhiman Anchal region of Odisha, which is considered to be a hotbed for Naxal activity. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The National Family Health Survey is an annual survey conducted to gauge improvements in health indicators. It is conducted by the Niti Aayog. As of 2020, 25 editions of the National Family Health Survey has been brought out. All the three statements are incorrect, so option D is the right answer. See, the National Family Health Survey is conducted periodically, usually once in every 5 to 6 years, and it is conducted by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Till date, 5 editions of the National Family Health Survey have been brought out, and this question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 4. See, these are the different editions of the National Family Health Survey that have been brought out by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and the latest edition, that is the 5th edition for 2019-20, has been recently published. Let's look at the next question. The Interstate River Water Disputes Act of 1956 has been enacted under which provision of the Constitution? The correct answer is option C, Article 262. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 8 that refers to an interstate river dispute between Andhra Pradesh and Telangana over the sharing of the waters of the Krishna River. Let's look at the next question. The Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism has been proposed by which country? USA, Switzerland, Belgium, or India? The correct answer is option D, India. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 9 in which the Vice President of India has referred to India's efforts at promoting the adoption of the UN Convention Against Terrorism, and he has called upon the global community to act against terrorism by isolating the state and non-state actors who are involved in sponsoring violent acts of terror. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme was launched as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan package to mitigate the distress caused by coronavirus-induced lockdown. Under the scheme, 26 most stressed sectors identified by the KV Kamath Committee have been covered. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 9, the sanctioning of loans under the ECLGS scheme has slowed down in the last few months. And this is directly affecting the businesses that were dependent on them because the funding or credit was supposed to be a key stimulus for reviving business and investment, especially in the MSME sector. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? While dealing with infectious viral diseases, environmental water surveillance is a useful tool to monitor virus activity in infected areas. It had played a critical role in the eradication of wild polio virus globally. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, the Indian Council of Medical Research has identified that environmental water surveillance can be a useful tool to track the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and to monitor the impact of our intervention strategies. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Chang'e 5 is a robotic lunar mission of China designed to bring back lunar soil samples. If the mission is successful, it would make China only the third country to have retrieved lunar samples after the United States and the Soviet Union. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 13 that makes a reference to the Chang'e 5 lunar mission of China, which is all set to bring back lunar soil samples to Earth. Let's look at a practice question from the 2017 prelims paper. Which of the following is geographically closest to Great Nicobar? Sumatra, Borneo, Java or Sri Lanka? The correct answer is option A, Sumatra. Please look at this map. This is where the Great Nicobar Island of the Andaman Nicobar Islands are located. This is where we have Sri Lanka. This is Sumatra. We have Java over here and Borneo over here. So by looking at the map, we can easily say that the Indonesian island of Sumatra is the closest to Great Nicobar amongst the given 4 options. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, by planning several large hydropower projects, India and China are placing the Himalayan region at great risk. Analyze. The second question, monitoring air pollution alone isn't enough. India needs innovative and context-specific solutions to tackle the problem. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.